Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. Welcome to our Perspectives Asia seminar for this evening. My name is Caitlin Byrne. I'm the director of the Griffith Asia Institute, and together with my colleagues from the Queensland Art Gallery, Gallery of Modern Art, many of you would know as Quagoma, it is my great pleasure to welcome you wherever you are and however you might be joining us, whether it's via Zoom, Facebook, or another platform, to this evening's Perspectives Asia seminar. To begin, let me respectfully acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we are meeting this evening. For me, here in Brisbane, it is the Turrbal and Jagera peoples, but of course there are many more joining from many other lands. In the spirit of reconciliation, I pay my respects to elders past and present and extend that respect to all First Nations peoples, including those who might be joining us this evening. And this evening, this is our fourth virtual Perspectives Asia seminar for the year. In fact, it's our fifth seminar for the year, our fourth virtual seminar. And I remember when we began in this virtual world, how scared we were of the technology. Now it seems slightly easier. It's still very daunting, but we're really delighted to have been able to work through this year, through these virtual platforms, to continue some important conversations. And in bringing these conversations to you, we work particularly closely with our colleagues at the Gallery's Australian Centre for Asia Pacific Art. And we're really trying to design and curate conversations that allow us to explore issues of contemporary culture, politics and society in our region, the Asia Pacific region. And it's been just such a pleasure to work with our colleagues, the wonderful team at ACAPA. I always get that acronym wrong, so I am sorry if I've done it again tonight, but the wonderful team led by Dr. Zara Stanhope. We've actually been working as institutions together for more than, well, nearly 16 years now, and I think I've felt particularly privileged to be a part of this relationship and to be able, through the course of these Perspectives Asia seminars, to bring to you speakers from right across the region who can look at key developments and give us some insights into what is happening within our own neighbourhood. Importantly, through this series, we hope to give voice to many perspectives and to generate conversations that ultimately will build understanding and empathy, and to bring conversations to you that are actually empowering. We also hope to unpack many of the complex social, cultural, political, and economic dynamics that really underpin the diversity and the richness of our region. And tonight is no exception, as the question that we've posed in this evening's theme, Thailand in protest, resign, rewrite and reform, really does suggest. The task that we've given to our speakers is to help us understand the current wave of protests and political expression that we've seen through the streets of Thailand across this year. It seems to be a story that remains underexplored in Australia in particular, but a story that is about young people, voice and agency, as well as about artistic and cultural expression and the politics of change. It's an important topic for us to talk about, to understand, and I'm really pleased to be working with the gallery to co-convene this discussion tonight. In particular, because when it comes to looking at contemporary artistic cultural practice of the region, Quagoma is a leader in the field. And I know in particular that their holdings have a special connection to artistic responses from right across Thailand to various uncertain social and political times. So, tonight's conversation will be led by Tamerlaine Beasley. Tamerlaine is the managing director and founder of Beasley Intercultural, a cross-cultural training and consultancy company. But Tamerlaine herself is an expert interculturalist, someone who has been engaged in Thailand, beginning as an exchange student in the late 1980s to present day, and has maintained and developed and fostered her connections, not just to Thailand, but especially to Thailand, but right across the Asia Pacific region. Tamerlaine is also a member of the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade's Australia ASEAN Council, and a wonderful advocate for Australia's engagement in the region. It's a real pleasure to be joined by her this evening. And Tamerlaine will be moderating a particularly fabulous panel. Once again, I'm really putting my linguistic skills to the test, and hopefully we'll do all right with this. But she will be joined firstly by Dr. Pandit Chanrochanakit, an assistant professor at the Department of Government in the Faculty of Political Science at Chulalongkorn University in Bangkok, Thailand. Someone who is well regarded for his expertise in visual and cultural politics, and an expert in contemporary Thai art and Thai contemporary politics in particular. Alongside Arjun Pandit, we will see Gridthiya Gaweewong. Gridthiya is no stranger to Quagoma. She's founded the arts organisation Project 304 in 1996, and she's currently artistic director of the Thompson Art Center in Bangkok. Her curatorial projects have addressed issues of social transformation, confronting artists from Thailand and beyond since the Cold War. And finally, the panel will also be joined by Matt Wheeler, Senior Analyst, Southeast Asia for the Crisis Group, the International Crisis Group based in Bangkok. He researches and produces crisis group reports and briefings, focusing in particular on political conflict in Thailand and the insurgency in Thailand's southernmost provinces. So I hope that you will agree this is a special conversation, a special panel, and we're really delighted to bring it to you. I'd also note that many of you are tuning in not just locally, but also from across the region and globally, and you are really welcome to take part in this Perspectives Asia seminar. We will welcome you to join us, not just on this virtual platform, but also by sharing your questions, and you can do that through the Q&A function that you'll find at the bottom of the screen. So please feel free to submit your questions at any time during this event. And as you do so, feel free to let us know where you're joining us from, if you'd like to do that. That's enough from me. Let me hand you on to our moderator for this evening, Tamerlaine Beasley, who I think will begin by setting the scene. Tamerlaine, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Caitlin. And it's fantastic to be here and having such a really interesting conversation with an incredible panel. So in terms of setting the scene, I'm not going to say too much because I think our speakers are incredibly well qualified to do that. I think it is an incredibly interesting time in Thailand, having been involved in Thailand for decades now and seeing protest movements come and go. I think something truly different is happening at the moment. We're seeing conversations in Thailand happening very publicly, which have never been possible and never happened before. We're seeing a form of protest which is incredibly creative, innovative, and different. And I think from the creative arts perspective, what's happening is fascinating in terms of new forms of expression. That said, political protest and political commentary in Thailand has always been fairly creative. Chulalongkorn and Thompson Art Universities, two of the large universities in Bangkok, have an annual soccer match, for example, and the soccer match is really not the main thing. It's more about the creativity of the floats and the chants and the students expressing incredible creativity around what's going on politically in that space. So there's often forms of conversation around politics that are creative in ways that I don't think we see as much in many other cultures in the region or in the West. So we're really going to tease that out today. So we have a really interesting audience, and welcome to everyone who's with us. We've got people joining us from universities, both Australia and internationally. We have people from institutes, multinational corporations, so from the corporate sector, from government in Thailand as well as elsewhere, and from media. So welcome to all of you, and I think you'll all find this equally relevant. Just one thing I would like to say is our three speakers are all based in Thailand. So aside from myself, and I'm in Sydney. So it is important to understand the uniquely Thai context. And one of the realities of this conversation that we do need to be aware of is Section 112 in Thailand and lèse majesté law means that it is actually a criminal offence in Thailand to say anything critical of the monarchy, and that can result in imprisonment from upwards of 3 years to life. So in terms of our speakers, they are in Thailand, so that law does apply. So just to let you know, sometimes if we're in Australia, people sometimes in questions can be very direct, and just recognising the complexity of the context we're in and the conversation we're having, and that we all demonstrate respect for what we're negotiating here. So I'm really looking forward to learning a bit more and facilitating a really great discussion. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Arjun Pandit to turn on his camera and unmute himself, and he's going to provide some context. So what we're going to do first is we're going to get a bit of context on what's happening. Then we're going to get some amazing visual summaries and slides from Ajahn Gridthiya, and then Matt's going to be talking a bit more about the political situation. We'll have a discussion among ourselves, and then we'll go to the floor for question and answer. So please do submit your questions, and I'll be keeping an eye on those, and we'll get through as many as we can. So over to you, Arjun Pandit. Thank you. I think Arjun Pandit is having a few issues with his audio. So what we might do is, if we can go to Matt Wheeler to talk a little bit about what's happening, and maybe our Griffith colleagues can help Arjun Pandit sort out the audio situation. So if that's okay, we might go to you for a moment, Matt. Matthew.
Thanks very much. So I thought it would fall to me to speak in the third slot, to perhaps introduce some more somber notes into the discussion, because it's really my task to look at how the government is reacting to the protest movement and where things may be heading. So Crisis Group, the organization I work for, published a report on the Thai political situation in early August. It came out on the 4th of August. And in that report, we noted that with the criticism of the monarchy growing online, that the government really faced a dilemma. And the dilemma is that if they tried to quash this criticism, they faced a potential backlash. But if they permitted it to continue, then they risk allowing the taboo against criticizing the monarchy to be broken. Well, the night before that report came out, so on the 3rd of August, the lawyer Anon Nampa gave a famous speech at Democracy Monument, in which he was dressed as Harry Potter. And in this speech, he publicly called for reform of the monarchy. And of course, this marked a turning point when the discussion of the monarchy's role in Thai society moved from the internet onto the streets. And of course, in the months since then, this criticism has grown louder, more public, and more strident. And the government's response, for the most part, has been to allow space for the protests to play out, to avoid confrontation. Now, there are some exceptions to this, which I'm sure we'll hear about. But at the same time, the government has also been employing a range of legal means to harass and intimidate protest leaders in particular. There are signs now that this approach is going to change, particularly last week when Prime Minister Prayut Chan-o-cha declared that all laws would be brought to bear against the protesters. And of course, this raises the specter of Section 112 of the Criminal Code, the lèse majesté law that Tamerlaine mentioned, being employed. And I should note that this law has really, it's been in abeyance for the past 3 years. So I'm going to return to what that change in the government's approach might mean and what the implications could be in a minute. But first, I want to say something about the nature of the challenge that this protest movement presents to the established political order in Thailand. Now, as I'm sure Ajahn Pandit would have told us, or will tell us, there were many episodes of political protest in Thailand's modern history, especially since the early 1970s. And Thai people have come out to press for a more plural and representative form of politics. But the current movement is different because it is directly challenging the political role of the monarchy. Now, when we think about the monarchy, we're really thinking about the reign of King Bhumibol. He reigned for 70 years, beginning in 1946. He died in October 2016. And it was in his reign that the institution of the monarchy went from something of a relic that really didn't sit very comfortably in a new constitutional order to become the embodiment of Thai national identity. And in particular, when we think about King Bhumibol's reign, we're thinking mostly of the reign at its height, at the height of King Bhumibol's powers. So that's from the late 1970s until about 2006. And this is a period that the academic Kasian Techapira calls the Bhumibol Consensus. Essentially, this means royalist hegemony. So any democratic reforms introduced during this period were always subject to approval by the establishment. In particular, the governance under the Bhumibol Consensus had three main characteristics. It was driven by elites and by their interests. Second, the distribution of power and benefits was hierarchical and clientelist rather than egalitarian. And it was essentially authoritarian, although it had a strong moralistic bent. So those of us who follow Thai politics or have an interest in Thai history, knew for decades that when King Bhumibol passed from the scene, when the ninth reign of the Chakri dynasty was over, that things were going to change in Thailand. But it was hard to imagine it, given that Bhumibol Consensus and the length of King Bhumibol's reign. But now it's 4 years later, and we are seeing a challenge to the status quo that can really only be compared to that of the People's Party in 1932. This was the small military and bureaucratic party that overthrew the absolute monarchy in 1932. Or perhaps even the Communist Party of Thailand, which waged an insurgency, particularly in the 1970s and 80s. But the current movement is different because it's unlike the People's Party of the 30s in that it's popular and it's broad-based. And it's unlike the Communist Party of Thailand in that it's nonviolent so far, and it's not tied to any political party. I think this moment is also one of generational change. And when I say that, I'm not talking about a cohort that's based on a common birth year. I'm talking about the kind of cultural upheaval that takes place, particularly in a conservative society, when it faces the need to adapt to changing circumstances. So young Thais now are butting up against a quite rigid social hierarchy, but also serious structural problems in the Thai economy and Thai politics. To illustrate the structural problems in the economy, I think it's important to point out that between 2015 and 2018, some 1.8 million Thais became poor, according to the official poverty definition. So almost 2 million people becoming poor in an upper middle income country in the absence of any external economic shocks suggests that there are structural problems afoot. The stakes of the conflict that are playing out now are extremely high. This is about what kind of society Thailand is going to have, how political power is going to be acquired and exercised, and what will be considered politically legitimate. Now, the incumbents in power, those who benefit from the status quo, I think it's fair to say are really just beginning to fight back against the protest movement. They will seek to preserve the political order that they engineered after the 2014 coup. As I mentioned before, mostly what they're doing now is employing legal tools in order to harass and intimidate the protest leaders in particular. And they do this in a variety of ways. They've been lodging charges against the leaders, arresting them, then they get released on bail, rearrested, and they're often transported to the places where the charges originate. So it's very taxing for those who are being subjected to this. We're also seeing harassment, not just of leaders, but also of ordinary people who speak out or people who participate in the protests. Very often, security officials will visit people that they suspect of dissident activity in an informal way and tell them that they should desist from their activities, whether it's participating in protests or posting things that are considered politically inflammatory online. Sometimes they're asked to sign memorandums of understanding and in which they pledge to cease these kinds of activities. And all of this is happening against the backdrop of the disappearance and murder of Thai dissidents in exile. At least 9 people in exile have disappeared since the 2014 coup, and at least 2 and probably 3, almost certainly 3, we know have been murdered. But as I said before, it looks like there's going to be a more forceful approach from the government from this point forward. Tomorrow, the protesters will march on the Crown Property Bureau, and there's a lot of concern that this marks a serious escalation. But this takes us back to the dilemma that I mentioned at the outset with respect to criticism of the monarchy. To my mind, the big question is, will suppression work? Is there a degree of suppression that can put the lid on criticism of the monarchy and the political status quo that will not also incite or excite a greater opposition to the government by Thai people? And taking the long view, I really don't think so. I think the taboo against criticizing the monarchy is certainly broken for now. And because the issue of political legitimacy is really about what Thai people think and feel with respect to the monarchy, I think greater coercion is really not well suited to changing those perceptions. Now, some people might say that the issue is not what people think and feel, but rather who has the money and who has the guns, who controls the levers of coercion. And we all know the answer to that question. But if that is indeed the right question to be asking, then Thailand is really in deep trouble because it implies that the future will be based on coercion rather than legitimized by the consent of the people. So those are my comments for now. I look forward to Q&A and to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Matthew. So I think what you've highlighted there is some of the complexities and realities, particularly and it'll be interesting to see what happens tomorrow with that particular protest. So what I'd like to do now is we're going to go to Arjun Gridthiya, who is going to share some slides to show you what exactly we're talking about in terms of these protests. So what has been happening and how have people been expressing themselves, and what is the scale of what's going on and what's the nature of it? Because I think it is, many of these expressions are uniquely Thai and they're quite cheeky and they're borrowing some interesting pop culture references. So over to you, Arjun Gridthiya.
Thank you so much. So first of all, I would like to thank the Griffith Asia Institute and the Queensland Art Gallery for inviting me and my friends to speak about what's happening in Thailand. And I would like to focus on the artistic and creative sides of the current political movement by looking at the history of socially engaged arts, or art for life in Thailand since the 70s. And this was the pretext of the free arts movement, which has been working closely with the free youth movement. And I will also talk about how young people and students adopt a so-called performance and public art in their demonstrations and are using popular cultures as their gimmick to communicate and convey the message to the public. The Leaderless Mob are multidisciplinary networks of different groups of students and allies in and outside of Thailand. So there's a long history of the Thai artists working with the demonstrators since the early 70s. Artists found a group called the United Fronts of Thailand to fight against the dictator and military regimes after the crackdown in 1974. The member was included with Sin Sawat Yot Bang Tei, Thamasak Bunchert, and Chachawan Chasuthishai, to name a few. They produced billboards that were displayed along Ratchadamnern avenues in 1975. In Simon Sung's PhD thesis, explained about this movement that this resistance and challenge was not solely directed at Thailand's military, a modern history of military dictatorship. It was also critical of how, since 1960, the military regime had cooperated with the United States in suppressing the communist dissident in Thailand. Moreover, the government has allowed the United States Air Force to conduct the airstrike over the North Vietnam from air bases in our country. So after that, this artist group started to practice a so-called art for life and art for people, which was highly different from the other school of thoughts in the mainstream art academy, which is Chulalongkorn University, which adopt the ideas of art for art's sake. We went through many coups and political crises in the 80s and the 90s, but the artists took a backseat to this movement, and their works were treated as a backdrop of the stage. So these artists included with Wasan Sittiket, Manit Vanishapum, and Ukabat Group, to name a few. In the early 2000s, the color wars between red and yellow shirts became parts of the political transition, marking a crucial time for Thailand's future, and the arts become more integral to the social movement. They re-emerged in the mid-2000s as part of the anti-Thaksin Shinawat's administration, which became known as the Yellow Shirt Movement. Many artists from the Artist Front of Thailand, who took part in the students' movement in the 70s, and lecturers of Chulalongkorn University joined the Yellow Shirts protests, and they culminated in the Bangkok shutdown and Art Lane before the Prayut Chan-o-cha staged the coup d'etat in 2014. So as the past decades of the political conflict produce a younger generation who grow up in this conflict and who are digitally and media literate. These young people who was born in the late 90s and early 2000s, some are the first-time voters. They supported the Young and the Progressive Party, Future Forward. The party won almost 80 seats in the last election, but a few months later, it was dissolved. So young people and their 6 million supporters were discontented with this verdict. In this, on the left-hand side, it was the girls who was part of the Great Church movement, and now she joined this students movement. And meanwhile, the younger students started to ask questions about the educational system, as well as the human rights violations of the political activists and the injustices that regularly occur. This has been intensified by the inefficiencies of how the governments deal with the COVID-19 crisis, while they were able to control the spread of the virus. Economically, the country went downhill. So these are the motivations that drove the post-COVID new normal mobs. They communicate via social media, such as Twitter, Facebook, IG, or even Telegram. Growing up with Harry Potter, computer games, Japanese cartoon, and the fans of South Korean wave, they are global citizens and transnational. And they use all this as theme for their public performance, to express the ideas, to criticize the government on how they misuse taxpayers' money. And they also push the boundaries by saying the unsayable out loud and propose to reform the constitution and monarchy. So here are the examples. So on the left-hand side is the Hamtaro, in the students' mob running in circles around the Democracy Monument. And the right one is the cartoon by Steph about Harry Potter, which are Anon Nampa, using the ironic Voldemort as a symbol of the you-know-it. The students' movement not only caught the government off guard, but their strategy was different from that of the red and yellow shirts, in that there were no leaders, the protests were random, and they used flash mobs. Many of these involved were swiftly arrested and released. opposition party politicians and university lecturers who monitored them closely, lent their support, and whenever the students and speakers were arrested, they promptly used their status to bail them out from jail. After their leaders were arrested in the mid-October, we wondered about the directions, but nothing stopped them. The next day, many more people gathered again at Rajpasong intersection and later at Lat Plau and Victory Monument, mobilizing by the Free Youth Group and become Leaderless Mob. This model allowed many groups of people who were oppressed by the states of the social structures to speak out and address their problems directly in the public. And in the name of art, the protesters used the term art to perform their civil disobedience and resistance against the authorities. When Amy, the Bottom Blues singer, started to splash colors on the police, he was accused of being violent against the police, but he said that it was his artistic action, as in action painting. Many people in the arts community debated whether it was art or not. That was not the point. Anyway, the protesters defended it by noting that it was less violent than how the state and the authority treated the protester, especially with the yellow shirts. He referred to how the yellow shirts has been treated in the last 10 years at Wat Pathum. So in reacting to the Parliament House crackdown last week, they threw the colors, the protesters went to Pathum 1 areas again, and they threw the colors on the facades of the headquarters of the police in Pathum 1 around Rajpasong intersections. For the free arts movement, they evolved slowly as the movement collaborated closely with the free youth. They organized the art festival in front of the BACC and later created the Fringe stage with the main protest at Sanam Luang in October and slowly transformed to the fashion show in Silom area. So this is one of the performances that has been performed by performers and people, which is a reenactment of the Richard's crackdown in front of the Wat Pathum. So the Mob Fest became an art festival consisting of music performance and speeches on the stage and brought together many artists, singers, performers, dancers, LGBTQ fashion designers. Artists work closely with the students and free people's movement by integrating the arts program with the mob's area. And the movement continues both outdoor and indoor, in public spaces and inside the institutions. So based on this context, the way the protest is very different from the past, like the red and yellow shirts. Because the demographic is different from the past, most of the members are from Bangkok and the suburban areas. The current mobs decentralized to the other provinces. The protests are organic and impromptu. So here are the students from Chiang Mai University who gave a speech at the Chiang Mai University stage on how education works. And with the support from the pro-democratic movement in Asia, such as Multi Alliance from Hong Kong and Taiwan, the protesters surprised us by every time that they staged the protest because they learned the lesson from the Multi Alliance, especially from the Hong Kong model. They modified the flash mobs using parodies as well as artistic creativities as their strategies, which are quite unpredictable. And like these yellow ducks, which were heroes on the night of the new Parliament's crash. They are now coined by the mobs as the new title and glorified by them later. So in short, these post-COVID new normal mobs are totally different from the past decades. They are game changers for sure. They trace the untold history and try to reimagine and reshape the future. The mobs are student-led, leaderless, multidisciplinary, multi-topic, decentralized, transnational, and ephemeral in nature, but they share the same goals. We don't know how long it will take to achieve these goals, but the only thing that we know that time is on their side. Thank you.
Thank you, Ajahn Gridthiya. That was a fascinating presentation. So what I'd like to do now is we're going to go to Arjun Pandit, who's going to provide us with a bit more context of what's going on, who are the different players, and some of the historical context for what we're seeing in Thailand today.
I hope now you can see my presentation. Okay. Now I'm sharing my screen. And my topic today is visualizing resistant Thai contemporary politics from 2006 to present. Okay. The presentation comprises of 4 sections. The first one is to give you some background from 2005 to 2010 and the events after post-2010 crackdown. And then I will talk about May 22nd coup d'etat. And lastly, I will talk about Thai politics since March 2nd, 2018 election. The first section, we have to understand the current Thai politics, not only from this current one, but rather go back to the very first moment of the conflict, starting by the dissolution of Thai Rakhine Party, and then former Thai Rakhine Party found the People's Power Party or PPP, and then after the coup d'etat in 2006, of course, we see Thaksin Shinawatra was ousted after September 19, 2006 coup d'etat, and of course the Thai Rakhine Party, excuse me. Okay, the Thai Rakhine Party organized and found a new party, so-called People's Power Party, and then the coup d'etat promulgated 2007 constitution and called for general election in December 23, 2007. The PPP won 223 seats, made it to power. Samak Suntharawet became prime minister. However, Samak was ousted because a charge that he is an employee for a private company. Somchai Wongsawat, Thaksin's brother-in-law, then succeeded Samak. The PPP was later dissolved from hiring a small-scale party to raise. As a result, Somchai was also disqualified after Samak. Then ex-PPP member found Pheu Thai Party. Meanwhile, Abhisit Vechachiwa from Democrat took over as the second largest party in the parliament. Supporters from Thai Rakhine Party, People's Power Party, and Pheu Thai Party then found the United Front Against Dictatorship, or UDD, or we know better known in the term of Red Shirt Movement. They rallied against Democrat Party but ended with the bloodshed on April 10 and May 18 to May 21st crackdown. And this is the site on April 10 crackdown. So after the crackdown, Abhisit dissolved the parliament and called for general election on July 2nd, 2011. Yingluck Shinawatra, the Pheu Thai Party leader and Thaksin's younger sister, came to power. Late 2013, Yingluck government proposed a blanket amnesty bill, sparked anger from every stakeholders and supporters. Anti-Thaksin group filed the People's Democratic Reform Commission, or PDRC, to shut down government's office. Yingluck's government stepped down on December 10, 2013 and called for general election on February 2nd, 2014. But the PDRC insisted that they want to end Thaksin's regime. They demanded reform before election. They called for a national government appointed by His Majesty the King. However, King Bhumibol has been hospitalized for months. This is an example, Wasan Siddicate, a prominent artist who joined the shutdown Bangkok movement in 2014. And of course, the Fine Art University or Silpakorn University was a main camp who rallied against Yingluck government as well. They demanded reform before election. That means they call for a national government appointed by the king. On the other hand, Democratic coalitions try to stand for the election as a last resort before the coup. Thus, the coup came. This is one example from a prominent artist, Suthi Kunavichayanon. In this painting, he shows Thaksin sitting on the back of the giant red crab, signifying Yingluck Shinawatra, because her nickname is Pu or crab. So this is very outstanding how Thai artists at the time imagined Yingluck government as a puppeteer of Thaksin Shinawatra. And of course, the dean of the faculty as well. So you can see a lot of prominent artists join the street protest in order to take down Yingluck government. And of course, the art lane movement as well to call for the national government. And of course, on the other hand, democratic movements respond to PDRC by self-organizing, to be in the public space. For example, the public park, BTS Skywalk, do the candlelight vigil, release the white balloons, and try to secure the vote and election by the movement so-called Respect My Vote. This is the picture from BACC or Bangkok Art and Cultural Center before coup d'etat in 2014. And people self-organizing these events by themselves without the head, the leader. You can imagine this somehow resonate in the youth movement now as well. After May 22nd, 2014, the National Council for Peace and Order, or NCPO, staged a coup. General Pandit Chanrochanakit became Prime Minister. He announced the roadmap that Thailand to return to democracy in 2015. But the first draft of the constitution was filed by the National Assembly at the time. The second draft, again, expected to finish and promulgate in 2016. But His Majesty the King, Bhumibol, passed away on December 13 of 2016. So it was postponed after the national mourning and the royal cremation. Then King Chulalongkorn signed and promulgated the constitution in 2017. And the NCPO called for general election in 2019. And during that time, you can imagine how the NCPO suppressed the people's movement. In this picture, it is the event organized by my student at Chulalongkorn University for the commemoration of October 6 to 1976 massacre. They invited Joshua Wong to give a speech, and Joshua Wong was expected to arrive at the airport. He was deported right away, and this is how we do at the time. He gave a speech via a video conference in which Thai authority came to the control room to unplug the conference if needed. And during the time, there was an incident in Gwangju as well at the Gwangju Museum of Art, or GMA. Guerrilla boys disrupt Suthi Kunavichayanon's exhibition in order to protest. And many more to come. The military, the junta sent the officials to art gallery to take down the exhibition. And what happens after 2019 election? I like to share a little bit for you to understand why the youth of Thailand are quite angry. In this slide, you see the result of March 2nd, 2019 general election. The Pheu Thai party gained most seats in the House, but Palang Pracharat party canvassed smaller parties and found a coalition for the mixed government. The third largest party, Future Forward Party, led by Thanathorn Jingrungruengkit, was of course, proposed to be the Prime Minister on the opposition coalition. As a result, however, Palang Pracharat and its supporters vote for Prayut Chan-o-cha gained 2,251 votes from Parliament, and together 2,049 from Senate, altogether 500. So he became the Prime Minister of Thailand. And of course, Future Forward Party was considered a threat to the national security because of the NCPO, the former general who enjoy their privilege in the parliament and both in the Senate as well, look at Future Forward Party as a threat. So they took the case to Constitutional Court, and on February 22nd of 2020, the Constitutional Court ruled that the Future Forward Party loan violate campaign rules. The court also banned 16 senior party leaders from politics for 10 years. As a result, the dissolution of the Future Forward Party and banning leading Future Forward Party member weakened the opposition coalition. And a day after the dissolution of Future Forward Party, that was the day of Thai youth start a flash mob, and similar events spread widely both in Bangkok and other provinces. The flash mob ended shortly before the widespread of COVID-19 pandemic. However, once the COVID-19 relief, all the flash mob came to surface again and led by the two major coalitions. The first one is United Front of Thammasat and Demonstration, or UFTD, and the second one made by the Free People Movement, or FPM. The two movements share their demands with help from pro-democracy wings, including former UDD members. That's how these youth came to street of Bangkok, and of course, you can see things, how things go on in Gridthiya's presentation. And this is all my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Arjun Pandit. Now, what I'm going to ask is if Matthew and Gridthiya can turn on their cameras, and we're going to have a bit of a discussion among ourselves before we go to Q&A. One question I have is about the expression and the use of pop culture and the connection to international pop culture within the movements. So, for example, the salute of the movement, the three-fingered Hunger Games, it references the Hunger Games. And K-pop has actually been huge in terms of Korean pop stars mobilizing on Twitter and raising money and supporting the movement, referencing to Harry Potter, for example. So I was just wondering, maybe Ajahn Gridthiya, if you could comment around this borrowing of international forms of art, but also the way that's locally interpreted. So, for example, there's rap against dictatorship, which is, you know, rap that actually looks and sounds quite similar to rap within the Black Lives Matter movement. So, Ajahn Gridthiya.
Yeah, thank you for the questions. I think I read the interview of one of the girls who initiated the Hamtaro project. You know, her answer to the reporter was like, she just wanted to use some kind of cultures that she can share with her generation. I remember the first time when the Hamtaro started, our generations don't really know what it was, you know, so we have to Google, you know, and we have to kind of understand why they used Hamtaro as a symbol, you know, and it is only one kind of one-time deals, you know, but the thing that I found is interesting is they use this, you know, and the next time they use Harry Potter, right? But the three finger salute, you know, is almost like a kind of a symbol of this movement. And like, again, you know, because of the natures of the popular cultures, it's really easy to understand, you know, and this is, I think, one rule to engage with the public is you need a communal language, the language that you don't need to explain much, but it's something more like, easy to access. And I think that might be the reason.
Interesting. And in terms of that communal language, protest movements in Thailand have often been quite concentrated in certain locations and very geographically oriented. So, Thaksin from the north, yellow shirts, very urban Bangkok. Matthew, I was wondering if you could comment around, obviously you've done a lot of work on the south. How is this movement and all of these protests differentiated throughout the very different parts of Thailand? Is it different? Or are you seeing really consistent forms of protest, particularly, it's interesting in the South, particularly?
I guess my answer is conditioned largely by the fact that I've been stuck in Bangkok for most of this period. I think one of the things that's important to know about the current protests is that they're happening not just in Bangkok, but all over the country. And this has been the case since before July. I think it's the convention now to look at the current protest period as beginning with the July 18th protest. But there were protests prior to that, again, mostly expressing dissatisfaction with political status quo, based particularly on the dissolution of the Future Forward Party. And these protests were taking place largely at university campuses, but not exclusively. And they were happening in different parts of the country, in the north, in the northeast, but also in other parts, in the center and in the south. I don't know too much about how the protests are playing in the deep south. What's interesting about the provincial capitals there is that in spite of the fact that this is a Malay Muslim majority part of the country, where there's been an insurgency nominally fighting for independence from Bangkok, the provincial capitals are really quite conservative. They're heavily populated by Thai bureaucrats and by Thai military officers. So there have been protests by people clad in yellow shirts showing solidarity or a desire to express their support for the monarchy just in the past month or so. And I think there are young Malay Muslims in the Deep South who are watching the pro-democracy protests with a great deal of interest. But I can't speak from firsthand research on the degree to which they're participating.
Interesting. And I just, Arjun Pandit, I know you were in Ubon recently. What are your thoughts about whether this is similar in Isan in the northeast of Thailand, or is it different in terms of how the movement is mobilizing?
I like to share the idea that the most recent development happens not only in the center of Bangkok, but rather the process of urbanization during the last decade somehow changed the terrain of the rural Thailand to be, an urban area. So we see a lot of people who's not literally so-called the poor as we imagine them during the last decade. We always look at the people in the rural area as people who uneducated, have a very low status in the country and don't have enough money to make ends meet, right? But nowadays, these people change a lot. I mean, the process of urbanization in Thailand spawned to the very place in rural area. So there is no longer the rural area as the urban people, as in Bangkok, imagine the rural area. So people in the very suburb, they're no longer living in poverty as we imagine. So they changed a lot. They became an active citizen. We witnessed not only from the protester from UDD or Dredchet movement to join the students movement. We see that they are from very different walk of life, very different career, different status, but they came together to foresee any possibility for their future. That's what I can observe from joining the protest. Of course, seeing from Ubon Ratchathani as well.
And it's interesting, I mean, seeing the massive industrialization of Thailand and the labor shortages in the agricultural sector in the last 10 years, where literally there's zero unemployment and labor has to be brought in from other countries to farm in Thailand. So that's a real shift in terms of the way people live in rural areas. But I think sometimes it's interesting in Bangkok, the imagining of what rural Thailand is like is not representing the realities. But now also with COVID, I was just talking to a friend in Thailand today who was saying the hospitality sector is surprisingly resilient because Thais are traveling in ways that they don't typically. You know, wealthy Thais in Bangkok used to go on international holidays and now they're exploring Thailand. So there's a lot of social change going on in the country. So I was wondering, Arjun, Gridthiya, in terms of social change, you know, you've seen different movements over the years, you've seen different protest movements, and there's been, I mean, Thailand has a history of protest and creativity around protest. Do you think this is different?
Yeah, of course, it's totally different. It's not only the nature of the demographic, you know, of the protesters, but also the way that they use artistic and creativities, you know, as a parody, you know, as a critique, as a tools, you know, to critique the states, the government, you know, or they express their ideas, you know. So, but for me, you know, the most interesting thing for me is not only the artists use these kind of artistic activities. It's the whole. It's really across the board, you know. It's people, you know. It's everywhere, you know. It's happened like, especially when you join the mob festival. It's really a clusters, you know, of people of different walks of life and different agenda that they want to address, you know, to the community, to their own community, and to get their voice heard, you know. So this is one of the important point that I wanted to stress out, and especially the LGBTQ, you know, as well as you know, people from like the bad students movement, you know, people who were oppressed. And it's not really like, it's not about the generations. And I think most of the time we thought that it's only younger generation, but I think now it's more expanded, you know, to people from, it's more like trans generations. And the reason that they joined the mob is just to share the same agenda that they wanted to address.
I think it's interesting too. I'd be interested, Matthew, around class and hierarchy. And Thailand has had fairly rigid class hierarchies, and the way Thai language is used often perpetuates those. But we're hearing Thai people speaking in ways that just don't reflect traditional hierarchies and using language in really radically different ways. But do you think class and hierarchy, and it's a real institutional challenge to the way power and structure and institutions have run historically in Thailand?
Yeah, absolutely, and I think that's reflected in the protests themselves. I think when one goes to the protests, and I've been to many of them since July. There's really a sense of exuberance and exhilaration, I think, that comes in part from the people overturning those hierarchies and the freedom and excitement that comes from doing so. Of course, this is what makes the movement appear so dangerous in the eyes of those who wish to preserve the status quo and to preserve the current hierarchies and classism that characterizes Thai society. I think it's interesting that the education system has come in for so much criticism on the part of the protesters, including, you know, high school students, quite young protesters.
Haircuts even.
Right, and they have real grievances, right? I mean, the education system has been failing Thailand for decades. It's not producing the kinds of graduates who can really help to lift Thailand out of the middle income trap that it's been in for a decade or more now. And it's characterized by the need to show deference at all times, obedience. It's quite discourages creativity, discourages critical thinking based on rote learning. And the students they recognize that it's not serving their interests, and ultimately it doesn't serve the interests of the country. But what it does do is it helps perpetuate that hierarchy that serves the interests of a very narrow elite.
Arjun Pandit, are you seeing students really challenging the system? Like, and the haircut mention I was saying is, Thai students have very strict rules around what they can and can't do, even to the length of it. They have to have certain haircuts, and they're rebelling in very small but noticeable ways against some of those, rigidities around the rules. Are you seeing, Arjun Pandit, when you're working in universities, are students not just challenging the dominant political system in terms of their protests, but are they challenging within the university system as well?
I think because of the tight regulation on the bodies, and education, you can see that these kids try to protest to the Ministry of Education and demand him to resign, right? Last gathering, the student asked if you could resign, and he denied it. So when it comes to the point of education and regulation, they look at school as the very first place of producing authoritarian regime in practice. So it's not only about the dress or uniform, but also the body, how sexual harassment occur at school and covered by authorities in school, and teachers, and all the education is not an education for liberating people, but rather to oppress the youth. That's why these young students in the very first place attack school and university as the prominent site of authoritarian regime.
Interesting. So, I mean, obviously these movements of resistance are happening at so many levels, from the level of a ribbon on a backpack to a haircut to in all of these spaces. So I'm going to start gradually weaving through some of the questions we're getting. But so one of the questions is, when and how might there be a pushback? And is that possible when you have resistance in so many disparate spaces? So what might, and I know I'm asking you to be fortune tellers here, but knowing Thai history and knowing the institutions and the power they have, what are your thoughts in terms of how there is a pushback? Gridthiya, are you seeing artists being shut down in ways that they haven't been, or is there an attempt at shutting down?
I think it will be more like igniting the creative power. If the artists or the creative sides, of the mobs hear something's gonna happen. For example, the yellow dogs, it's really about the reactions, of the authorities, that they're trying to kind of play back, or react against what is happening. And so I think it won't be, I mean, even though from the states, trying to push back, in the future, I don't think it will slow down or, weaken the movement.
Matthew, do you think that there's a chance, like in terms of a crackdown, or do you have concerns, or do you have any thoughts around where this might end up resolving itself, or is a resolution possible, or is this something that's likely to simmer on for a long time?
Yeah, I'm definitely have concerns about a pushback from the government and from the defenders of the status quo. Like I said in my comments, it's a dilemma for that sector because if they employ greater force to do it, if troops come out on the street, or God forbid, protesters are shot down,
Yeah.
then that's going to produce a backlash.
Mm.
The question is, can they ride out that backlash? I was at Democracy Monument on the 10th of April in 2010 when the red shirts were protesting. Their demand was for a new election. The army was out on the streets already, and that was the night where the bullets started flying. And I saw people killed and dying as a result of that incident. And I remember thinking at the time, the prime minister, who at the time was Abhisit Vejjajiwa, I thought the prime minister will have to resign tomorrow as a result of this bloodshed. Of course, that didn't happen. And the military crackdown dragged on for some time until the 19th of May. And in that entire span from 10th of April to 19th of May, almost 100 people were killed. Not all of them protesters, but more than 90 of them protesters killed by the army. And there were no consequences for that at all. No one's been held accountable for that. So, you know, I don't want to suggest that that a backlash against greater coercion would definitely spell the end of this current government. That's not necessarily the case, but it would take Thailand to a very, very dark place.
Arjun Pandit, without asking you to be a fortune teller, do you have any sense of what is there likely to be a pushback, or, you know, do you think this will keep happening, these protests? I mean, it's very difficult to know, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. And I like to say that there are many times that it's possible that the suppression, you know, or the violence will be applied to students. But on the other hand, on the students and the protesters' reaction against such action is quite interesting. They try to secure all the peaceful manners. For example, you know, they have we volunteer guard of themselves. This group of young people are from vocational schools, and they are very good people. They are very, very calm, and, you know, did very good in the very crisis moments. For example, whenever the protester throw things to the crowd control unit, you know, these guards came to block between the protester and the officials. And by this means, they try to secure a peaceful gathering. That means the government cannot break in or apply any violence against this protester. They don't have legitimacy enough to break down or to crack down the movement. So as long as the student can uphold to the situation that they don't use or try to stage violent action against the government officials, I think they can, you know, prolong their movement on street of Bangkok, as long as there is no coup d'etat. And
it's interesting, isn't it, given the amount of energy of young people with social movements, you know, there is the risk that there's going to be some people who are a bit overexcited, but it has been remarkably calm and well organized and well controlled. One question, we've had a couple of questions which I'm going to weave in together, but around external influences. So one person's mentioned the US being in and trying to stir things up. Another person, so K-pop, for example, and Korean pop stars have been raising significant amounts of money. So that issue around external engagement, and we've also had other questions around is the international community going to do anything, or is the Thai government concerned about the international community? So just the connections to outside of Thailand and how they're playing themselves out internally. I'm not sure if any of you would like to comment on that. Maybe Matthew?
Yeah, I mean, certainly, people have heard the notion that there are Western powers, particularly the U.S., trying to stir up or to incite the protest movement against this government and against the Thai monarchy. I mean, this is one of the defenses that the yellow shirts or the Salim or the defenders of the status quo are advancing now, and it betrays a strain of xenophobia in Thailand, which is quite disturbing. I mean, these are conspiracy theories essentially. No one can produce any evidence to support these assertions, but they inevitably play well in certain segments of the Thai media and of course on social media. So that's one thought I have. Sorry, what was the other part of the question?
So it's basically how internationals are getting involved. So there's, K-pop raising money, and
I'm sorry. I think the governments and the embassies here are I mean, they're obviously quite concerned with what's happening. They're following it very closely, but they're also caught in a bind. They don't want to be seen to be taking sides in internal affairs of Thailand. And they also have to be very conscious of, as we all do, of the fact that the monarchy, the head of state, is enmeshed in the demands of the protesters, and inevitably also in the response of the Thai state to what's happening.
I think one thing too that's come up in some of the questions is that this isn't as simple as one party versus another. Like, there's a lot of really complex, even the demands of the protesters are pretty big and broad, and that some of them are changing slightly, but also there's a lot of layers of complexity in terms of Thai politics and power. And there's a lot of people competing also. So one person was talking about, is it potentially, risk that Thuksins are going to come back in, or other people will come in, and, is it a matter of one out, another one in? I mean, Thailand, historically speaking, has, until Thaksin, was always coalition governments, and it was always shifting, the seats around, but with the similar blocks of power. So are we likely to end up with the same people but different titles on the political parties, for example? Maybe Arjun Pandit, do you think it is likely to, is that a possibility in terms of how will we see some returns of some of the older politicians and the previous parties, like Thai Thai, for example?
I was thinking on the one hand, Thai conservative elites always create a national enemy. Excuse me. And Thanathorn Chanrochanakit from Future Forward Party, or now on Kanak Kao Klai, is another national enemy created by such sentimental and, of course, came into the same plot of conspiracy theory that Thanathorn, together with foreign country, try to intervene domestic affairs of Thailand. And the youth doesn't buy this, I would say. Rather thinking that our country has been frozen for many years due to such kind of plot and also the sentiment against the Western influence. Actually, we all realize that the Western influence is already here for many years. Back in the 50s, the U.S. intervention in Thai politics is quite outstanding, right? Our neighbor countries suffer from the intervention from the U.S. military and government. But nowadays, the U.S. government, of course, we are witnessing the changing and transition from Trump's administration to Biden administration. That will create another environment for Thai politics as well. And of course, we have to understand that that there is kind of tension between, you know, U.S.-China relations as well. The One China policy somehow affect on the youth of Thailand, as well as, you know, whenever they think about the multi-alliance, right? And these people, they try to connect each other. We look at Joshua Wong, we look at Taiwan's movement, and of course, you see this is for the first time that people in entertainment industry came to involve in Thai politics much more than ever. Probably the very first time that we have the so-called fandom, or, you know, the fan of BTS, a boy band from Korea, and we have many supporters who collect monies from the fan base and donate to this movement on the street of Bangkok. And that became the big thing, because never before that this generation are quite active in politics, because we always see, or let's say my generation, the X generation, we always look at this generation as online generation. They only, you know, active in on Facebook and Twitter, right? And we somehow underestimated them, that they will not be on street. And they did. I mean, in the very recent weeks, we see more and more to come on the street of Bangkok and everywhere, not only in Bangkok, but Chiang Mai, even the deep south, the three southernmost provinces are still, you know, active by the youth over there. So we witness that Thailand will never be the same. Thailand has changed. And it is because, of course, the disruption from COVID-19 pandemic on the one hand. Economic recession is a global phenomenon, right? But also the internal conflict that lasts for a decade. And as I said in my presentation, we have to look back as early as 2005, 2006 in order to understand this very moment of conflicts on the street of Thailand. So the kids or the youth have come to the very center of Thai politics and Thai political problems. That is the monarchy and the military intervention in politics. And of course, the new kind of relation has to be adjusted, not only to secure, you know, the transition of the monarchy, but also to imagine the new decade of Thai politics as well. And probably if you look at the current constitution, the current constitution create the same situation as Thailand had in 1980s during General Prem Tinasulanont era. That is, we call semi-democracy. But now even worse, it's just a quarter democracy or 1/4 democracy. You can see Prayut Chan-o-cha came to power on the one hand from parliament. He has 251 votes from parliament and 249 from Senate. So in this sense, the senator came to power and support the junta even more than in the 1980s. So we are seeing Thailand, on the one hand, people are looking forward to the future. People are expecting that the government will revive a better situation to the whole country, to return the future to the people. But on the other hand, the government trying to drag them back to 1980s. And this is now 2020 already. We cannot go back to 1980s. Come on.
I think it's interesting too. I just heard today that apparently it's interesting. We often forget, we think social media is all about modern pop concepts, But history, the sales of Thai history books have doubled recently. So it's interesting because young Thais are really engaged in understanding history. And when I was talking to Matt in preparing for this session, I was saying, do people know about what happened in the 70s? And Matt's point was absolutely, history is informing this, and people are very historically connected. So through social media, they're learning more about their history. So it's interesting, this whole complexity. Yes.
All right. I mean, just an anecdote. It's not just young people, right, who are getting turned on to this. I met someone at a protest. It was the 14th of October, which was a big one. This was a woman in her late 40s who had 2 teenage daughters. Neither of the daughters were at the protest, but she decided to come. She thought it was important. This was the first protest she'd ever attended. And I asked her, why did you decide to come today then? And she said, well, now that my daughters are older, I have more time on my hands. And now that I have access to the internet, like I have access to more information. So I've been learning about Thai history. So it's not just the young people who are discovering what happened in the 1970s, for example, but people from other generations as well.
Okay, I'm aware we need to wrap it up now. So if we can just get a couple of closing comments, and I know it's been a very broad-ranging discussion, but Ajahn Gridthiya, would you like to make a couple of comments to close just before we pass to Chris Sains, who's the director of the Queensland Art Gallery, to thank you?
Yeah, I think I just want to follow what Matt and Arjun Pandit spoke about. The younger generations pay attention to the history. I think what we've been observed and also discussed with some of them, they're trying to kind of like return to the histories of the losers, you know, in the 70s, especially in 6 October and the Red Shirt movement. And I think this is very important to note that the way that this part of history has never been taught, and it has been suppressed as well as absent, you know, in the mainstream educational system. So that's why a lot of them return to the alternative histories, and that's why many publications house, especially Phao Dio Kan or The Same Sky and the Tamra Sangkom Sat of Ajahn Chanrit, you know, has been really like a boom, you know, for these publications. And I think this is, for me, you know, I see it's a golden age, you know, of younger generations and also peoples from my generation who's kind of like getting back to the alternate histories. And I think this is very important. And I really hope that the new era of Thailand, you know, it will be the forward thinkers and the present as well as the future will win over the conservative and hyper-realists. Thank you very much.
Arjun Pandit, did you have a couple of comments to close with today?
Oh, yes. Yeah, similar to Gridthiya, I think as a professor in university, I'm really close to the students who join the protest. And of course, many of my students are the leaders of this protest, not only from Thammasat, not only Chulalongkorn University, but also from Thammasat University, and also many of my friends who came from the corner of artistic practice and cultural practices. I would like to call for attention from international community to support this youth movement and also to support the Thai protester in order to, at least try to understand what's going on in Thailand and try to understand the situation. It's really complicated because we have to look back at least 10 years in order to understand the very moment of this crisis. So looking forward to a future, I hope that Thai society learn from the past, that we've been through a lot for as early as October 14, 1973, October 6 massacre back in 1976, and the most recent one, 1992 bloodshed in May, and of course in 2010, last 10 years ago. And I think we can break through a new century without bloodshed. I really hope that Thai society now mature enough to understand that anything could be negotiated, anything could be discussed on the ground, that we have come to a new consensus in this era. This is my hope.
Thank you very much. Matthew.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I mean, Thailand needs to come to a new consensus on what constitutes political legitimacy. It's hard to be optimistic, frankly, looking around at what sort of mechanisms are available to achieve that. You know, the king said Thailand is the land of compromise. So I hope that the government is listening and that that compromise can be achieved.
I think there's some great comments to finish on. So I'm just going to add to that and say, I hope that whatever happens, it's for all Thais. And Thailand has an incredible history of achieving extraordinary things. So as friends of Thailand internationally also, we're all hoping that that's still possible in terms of compromise and moving forward. And we're looking forward to being there with you. So over to you, Chris. And Chris, if you could leave your videos on, please, and just mute yourselves, our speakers. Thank you.
Thank you, Tamerlaine. And on behalf of the Griffith Asia Institute and the Queensland Art Gallery and Gallery of Modern Art, it really is my great thrill to be able to thank all of you. We have the great privilege of hearing you from Thailand. So to Matthew and Gridthiya and to Pandit, can I convey the thanks of everyone who's been listening? I think it's been an extraordinarily absorbing conversation. Matthew, when you began, I felt that you were sounding a warning to us, and you've echoed that warning in the remarks you just made. And in the pre-conversation, you were saying, look, it didn't matter if I go at the front of the conversation or the end of the conversation. And I think hearing what you had to say, it really did not. I know that crisis and political crisis is your area of speciality, but you gave us a sense, I think, really this evening of urgency. And that I was particularly struck when you said that the future could be based on coercion, maybe even will be based on coercion. And that's a great worry for those of us looking on, and even deeper worry for those of us who are participants. And Gridthiya, thank you too. I was absolutely I found your presentation really joyous in a way, because you are opening up so many windows into the ways in which popular culture has spoken back and spoken of the protests of the democratic movement in Thailand, not just in recent times, but historically. And I feel that the role of the visual artist in particular is something that we're very conscious of here in Brisbane, because the APT lives in Brisbane. We established it in 1993, and Basan Sitikat was one of the foremost artists of political protest, based with Upanand Poshinanda and others at Chulalongkorn University. And having visited there in 1996, I remember what an extraordinarily active university, how active the Art Center was in all sorts and forms of political protest. And performance, I recall, was used then as it's used today to recall massacres and atrocities which have been perpetuated against some of the protesters. And I think that, Pandit, it was wonderful to have you as well give us a sketch of the political history, which if any of us try and tell the political history of our own country, that's one thing. And it's quite challenging to try and tell the political history of another country to Australians. I found I learned a tremendous amount from the kind of trajectory of both protest and resistance on the part of the freedom fighter, if you will, and the military opposition against that struggle. I was reminded in 1995, when the Gwangju Biennale was born, it was born of the Gwangju democratic movement that was brutally put down 15 years previously by the military government of the day. And I remember being in Gwangju in 1995 and being told that, in a way, the building of these pavilions and the establishment of this Biennale was a kind of panacea to the hurt and the loss that was perpetuated. It's not even today, I think, known just how many of the protesters perished. And so I'm reminded of what a long and complex history protest for democratic rights has undergone over the last many decades in Thailand. And it was really good to have all of you etch in a part of that story in very different ways. And the Yellow Ducks, I've seen a little bit of coverage of that. The Hunger Games salute, it only really occurred to me tonight what was going on. But I thought the K-pop story was so illuminating. And the fact that K-pop, who would have thought, has become a cause for good. They even pretty much closed down a Trump rally, and now they're providing funding to protesters on the street in Bangkok and elsewhere in Thailand. So look, it's been a really rich and vivid picture that you've painted for us. Thank you to all of you, and thank you, Tamerlaine, for the way that you've, I think, stitched the elements of this fabric together so thoughtfully and so carefully through the course of the conversation. So to all of you, on behalf of the Queensland Art Gallery and of course the Griffith Asia Institute, thank you for your time tonight, and thank you to our audience. I noticed that we've hardly lost one of you in the course of this hour and a half, so that says much for the compelling nature of the conversation we've had. So to everyone, on behalf of Caitlin Byrne, good night and thank you for joining us tonight.